Okay, so we're back in the Rambam's Mishneh Torah. We're in the second book, Sefer Ahavah, the book of love. We are in Hilchot Berachot, so this is the laws of blessings. We're in Perek Dalet, chapter 4. It says, one who recites grace after meals, or the summary of the first three blessings, al hamichia, must recite the blessing in the place where he ate. If one ate while walking around with his home, like walking around within his home, he should sit in the place where he finished eating and recite the blessing there. If one ate while standing, he should sit in his place and recite the blessing. If one forgot to recite grace after meals and remembered before the food in his innards was digested, he should recite the blessing in the place he remembers. But if one left the place where he ate without reciting grace after meals willfully, he must return to the place he ate and recite the blessing there. Even so, if he recited the blessing in the place he remembered, he has fulfilled his obligation. So too, if one recites the blessing while standing or while walking, he has fulfilled his obligation. But it is preferable not to recite grace after meals or the summary of the three blessings except while seated and in the place one has eaten. So one who is unsure whether he recited the hamotzi blessing or not does not repeat the blessing, for the obligation is not of biblical origin. If one forgot to recite hamotzi, so if he remembers before completing his meal, he must recite the blessing. But if he has already completed his meal, he does not recite the blessing. If one was eating in one house and stopped in the middle of his meal and went to another house, or was in the middle of a meal and was called by a friend to speak with him, and went outside the entrance of his house and then returned, since he has changed his place, he must recite the after blessing for what he has already eaten, and then repeat the hamotzi blessing before eating and completing his meal. Friends who sat together for a meal and got up to greet a bridegroom or a bride, if they left an elderly or sick person in the place where they ate together, they may return to their places and complete their meal without having to recite the blessing again. But if they left no one in place when they leave, they must recite the after blessing, and when they return, they must recite the blessing before eating. This is also the rule if they get together to drink or to eat fruit. For anyone who changes his place has interrupted his meal and must therefore recite the after blessing on what he has already eaten, and then repeat the blessing before food for what he intends to eat. One who moves his place from one corner to another in the same room need not repeat the blessing, but if one ate at the eastern side of a fig tree and then moves to eat on its western side, he must repeat the blessing. So one who recites the blessing for bread thereby exempts the accompanying dish eaten with the bread. One who recites the blessing for bread thereby exempts the accompanying dish eaten with the bread, so any side dishes or whatever, whether it is cooked food, fruit, or anything similar. But if one recites the blessing for the accompanying dish, one does not thereby exempt the bread. So let's say you have mashed potatoes. If you say Berei Pri Ha'adama, and then you say, and then you eat some bread, before you eat the bread, you should say the hamotzi. So if one recites the blessing for the accompanying dish, one does not thereby exempt the bread. If one recites the blessing on grain cooked dishes, he thereby exempts non-grain cooked dishes. Well, if one recites the blessing on non-grain cooked dishes, one does not thereby exempt grain dishes. Okay, so it's kind of like top down, sort of almost in the way that, Birkat HaMazon is a longer after blessing, and Al Hamichia is shorter, and then Berei Nefashot is even smaller. So what those would correspond to, it sounds like those take precedence over what else is with your meal, right? So one who intended to stop eating or drinking and then change his mind and wishes to continue to eat or drink must repeat the blessing even if he did not change his place. But if one did not intend to stop and intended to continue drinking or eating, even if one paused for the duration of an entire day, one need not repeat the blessing. So that's kind of iffy there. So sometimes when you sit down to eat and you have a bunch of food and you're like, wow, I'm stuffed, I'm gonna sit here and wait for a half hour, 45 minutes, and just spend time talking with friends at the table, and then I'm gonna continue my meal. So that's when something like that would need to be considered. For example, if a group were drinking wine and said, "Let us recite the grace after meals," or "Let us recite the kiddush of the day," they may not drink until they recite the grace or the kiddush, and they want to continue drinking before reciting grace or kiddush, although they are not permitted to do so. They must repeat the blessing of Borei Peri Hagafen, who creates the fruit of the vine, before drinking. But if they said, "Let us recite Havdalah," they need not repeat the blessing. So if a group sat together to drink wine, and another type of wine was brought before them, for example, if they were drinking red wine and a black wine was brought before them, or they were drinking old wine and new wine was brought before them, they need not recite the blessing over wine a second time. Rather, they recite the blessing, "Blessed are you, Hashem our God, King of the universe, who is good and does good. Hatov v'hamitiv." Okay? One may not recite the blessing over any food nor any drink until it is in one's presence. If one recited the blessing and is only brought before him afterwards, he must repeat the blessing. So if the food's in the kitchen, you're in the dining room, so it's like in a different place, assuming that there's no divisions or anything like that there, then that would be a case where you can't say the blessing for food that's off in this room, in the kitchen. So one may not recite the blessing over any food nor any drink until it is... Okay, got that. If one took food and recited the blessing over it, and it fell from his hand and was burnt or washed away by a river, one should take another portion and repeat the blessing, even if it is of the same kind, and one must say, "Blessed is the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever." For the first blessing, expressing additional praise for Hashem in order not to express the name of Hashem in vain. So, Baruch Shem Kavod. Okay, let's see. A person may stand at a water channel and recite the blessing and then drink, although the water that was in front of him when he recited the blessing is not the same water that he drinks, as this was his original intent. So, like, the water's moving downstream. So if you're in a situation like that, you can say the blessing. You can stand there at the water and recite the blessing and then drink. So foods that are served during the meal alongside bread and belong in the meal, such as meat and fish, do not require separate blessing before or after eating them. Rather, the Hamotzi blessing at the beginning and Birkat HaMazon, grace after meals at the end, exempt them all, for they are all secondary to the meal. Foods which do not belong in the meal, such as dates and pomegranates, which are served during the meal, do require a blessing before eating them, but do not require separate after blessing. So foods that are served following the meal, whether or not they belong in the meal, require a blessing before and after eating them. So on Shabbos and holidays, or at meals served after bloodletting or after leaving the bathhouse, or on similar occasions, when a person bases his meal on wine, if one recites the blessing for wine before the meal, one exempts the wine that is drunk after the meal, before the recitation of grace after meals. But on other days, one must repeat the blessing before drinking wine after the meal. So if wine is served during a meal, each of the diners recites the blessing independently, for the throat is not free to respond Amen to one who would recite the blessing for them all. But this blessing does not exempt the wine drunk after the meal. That is the end of chapter 4.